Hey guys, welcome back to the last part of chapter 13, and this will be the last part that's going to be on exam 3 that is coming up very quickly for you guys. So one of the things that we talked about last time was just kind of the idea of how different types of viruses can infect different types of cells. So we talked about the difference between latent and lysogenic, I'm sorry, not latent, lytic and lysogenic cycle for the bacteriophages. And then we also talked about the animal process getting into cells and focused in on that release where sometimes we get that envelope and why it is that envelope is so difficult for our immune system to find. Also talk about reverse transcriptase and the type of virus that carries the reverse transcriptase like HIV and how it encodes itself into our genetic material. And then we talked about the fact that sometimes viruses do in fact cause cancer, and that was the last thing that we touched upon. So we're going to start here talking about some different types of infections. For the most part, when you guys get sick with a viral infection, you get what's called an acute infection, and that's actually where you get sick. It may take a little bit for you to get over. Sometimes it might take a couple of days. Sometimes it may even be a couple of weeks before you start actually feeling better and getting over it. But typically what we find is that you have these symptoms that spike, and then you may not feel 100%, but you do at least start to feel a little bit better and a little bit better and a little bit better. But with viruses, it's interesting because sometimes there are viruses that actually never get out of your system. There's what we call a latent virus. Latent viruses are those that are constantly inside of your body, but not necessarily always showing symptoms. For example, if you have herpes, type 1 is above the belt, type 2 is below the belt. But if you have herpes and you are taking a look at whether or not you test positive for herpes type 1. Even if you don't have an active cold sore or fever blister, you still test positive for that herpes virus because it lays dormant inside of your peripheral nerves. When it's activated, usually it's activated by a trigger. And if you have fever blisters, you guys know what that trigger is. Sometimes it is maybe sun exposure. Sometimes it's stress. Sometimes if maybe you feel sick. A lot of times if you're ill, that will kind of bring your immune system down, which then allows that virus to kind of flare up. Shingles is the same way, also a herpes virus. Herpes, the varicella virus, which is herpes type 3, it causes chickenpox. And if you have had an active outbreak of chickenpox, you are now then subject to a potential outbreak of shingles. Not everyone gets a secondary outbreak of this. Some people do, some people don't. But still, the fact remains that the virus that causes shingles, if you have had chickenpox, is there always remaining in your body. Then we have what are called persistent types of viral infections. And these infections actually always are progressing. And it doesn't necessarily have to be something that you would really be suffering from, but there's always potential progress for these. And so you start off with these maybe just having an initial infection, and then over time it does start to get worse and worse, and it accumulates on itself until ultimately it is fatal. A lot of people ask me about vaccines and how I feel about vaccines, and vaccinations for me are an extremely important part of making sure that our children are taken care of and healthy. And one of the things that we do have is the MMR vaccine, measles, mumps, and rubella. And the MMR vaccine is given so that in case you do get measles, if you come into contact with the measles virus, you already have antibodies that are circulating so that potentially and hopefully you would never have to suffer from that. Some people say, well, who cares if you have measles? It's just a virus. Technically, that's not true because the measles virus actually runs a very high risk of subacute sclerosing panencephalitis, which is a persistent viral infection that typically kills people in their early 50s. So maybe they're, 7, 8, 9 years old when they get measles, and throughout their lifetime, this continues to progress and it continues to be in their system causing problems until finally around somewhere in their 50s it ultimately kills them. So persistent viruses, people say, well, it's just a virus that you don't get and that's the only thing that vaccines do for you. That's not actually true. They can potentially save your life, and we know that for a fact. One of the interesting things that we have in the body that is a fascinating, and I mean fascinating, type of infection are called prions. And I know a couple of you are doing your papers on prions. And the interesting thing about this is, first of all, they're proteins. And they're proteins that are normally found. Everyone has prion proteins located on the cell surface. But what happens when the protein starts to accumulate what's called a scrappy protein, it's a PRPSC protein, it starts to accumulate in the brains and it starts to form these gigantic holes inside of the brain. The diseases that these infectious proteins cause are actually called spongiform encephalopathies, which technically, if you break that word down, it means it turns your brain into mush. It takes your brain, think of a sponge, it's very porous, right? It's very squishy. Well, when you deal with a brain that has a lot of holes in it and has this kind of squish material that doesn't process information the same, these particular patients live no longer than about 6 months after diagnosis, and that's really pushing the limits there. Most of them are dead within a few weeks when they're diagnosed with this. The thing that happens with these infectious proteins, though, and you can inherit them, you can actually pass them on, you can transmit them, which means that you can either get them by eating something that has these infectious proteins, you can get transplanted tissues that have these proteins, or if there are surgical instruments that are not cleaned the way that they should be cleaned, then you potentially can spread prions this way also. The way that we found prions was really fascinating because prions began by the study that was actually done in animals, and there was a sheep herder, and this sheep herder came out one day and noticed that his sheep were in the field grazing, and he was missing some of them. And to be exact, he was missing 3, and he looked all over for these 3 sheep. Well, finally he looked up on a cliff, and up on the cliff there were 3 sheep standing towards the edge. So he went up there and he got these sheep and he gathered them up and he brought them back down. And the next day he comes out, sure enough he's counting his sheep and he's missing 3. So he looks up there on the cliff first thing, and what do you know? There they are, standing up there on the cliff, just standing there. Now there's nothing at the bottom of the cliff, only rock and a large drop that would mean for sure sudden death. So the farmer goes back up there and he brings his sheep back down, and he really doesn't think much of it until on the 3rd day he goes out. And he actually looks up at the cliff before he even counts the sheep, and there's nothing there. And so he kind of smiles to himself and walks out and he starts counting his sheep, and sure enough, he's 3 short. And so he starts looking around and he's looking everywhere, and he's literally looked in every spot that he possibly can. And he finally decides, just on a hunch, that he'll go up and look over that cliff. And so he does. He goes up and he looks over the cliff, and guess what he finds? At the very bottom, amongst the rocks, were 3 dead sheep. It was a very bizarre thing for him, and he didn't really know what to think about it until about 4 months later, when he came out and he was counting sheep and he started missing some, and he looked up on the cliff and he saw his sheep standing there. Well, he just so happened to have a friend who was in veterinary medicine. And he called his friend and he said, listen, can animals be depressed? And his friend was kind of like, what are you talking about? And so he told him about his sheep. And he told him that he had 3 sheep that he thought committed suicide. And now here are these 3 sheep that are going to do this also. And so his friend was intrigued. And he came out to the farm and he started doing some samples. And through a very large study, it turned out that the sheep had actually been infected because the grass that they were eating contained infected ants. Now, normally when ants are infected, they go to the top of grass blades and they gather together. You know, if you're an ant and you're in a field with grazing sheep, your safest place is definitely not at the top of a blade of grass. It's down inside of your ant hill. But these ants, for whatever reason, were gathering up at the top of the grass. And so they started taking a look at what was happening to the sheep. And they asked if he could have one of the sheep that had not died yet, but had been found up on the cliff. And so the farmer agreed, and they took the sheep off, and they put it to sleep, and they looked at its brain. And sure enough, its brain had become almost so eaten with holes in it that it was almost unrecognizable to some parts of the brain. So they came back after a long study and found out about prions and about this spongiform encephalopathy, and they said, listen, you know, those first sheep, what happened to them? And he said, well, I went down and I gathered them up and I sold them for Scrappy. And Scrappy you sell to feed to other animals, and its brains and guts and everything kind of mushed up together that some farmers feed pigs and cattle. And he said, I sold it to a cow farmer down the road. And so they went down the road to the farm where they sold it, and they said, listen, did you buy some Scrappy from these people? And they said, yes, we did. And they said, well, out of curiosity, after you fed your cows this Scrappy, did any of them act different? And the cow farmer said, well, that's funny that you should say that because, yeah, I had a bull that went crazy on me and I had to put him down. He said, well, what do you mean he went crazy? And he said he started running into the side of the building and slamming his head over and over into the barn. And so they said, well, what did you do after you killed him? And he said, well, I took him to the butcher and I had him butchered. So there you go. You go and you order you a rare steak, and that steak just so happens to have infectious proteins, and that's how we came about finding mad cow disease. So the history behind this, just the idea behind these animals that are very aggressive or they sort of seek out suicide. We actually find that in patients also. Their brain is so deteriorated that they can't make decisions anymore. Their personalities change. The way that they think and process information changes. By the end of their life, most of them really have no idea or sense of the world around them. It's an extremely sad condition. As far as we know, there have been 0 survivors from this ever. Most of the people who suffer from this die very quickly. We do know, if you want an interesting one to kind of read about, there's a tribe in Africa, and when someone in the tribe dies, it is their custom to eat their brain. Their brain and their heart, that's where their soul is located, and when they eat the brain and the heart, that actually helps with reincarnation of this person and make sure that their spirit goes where it's supposed to go. It's called kuru. And with kuru, they're actually ingesting these infectious proteins because they're eating, and I know it is essentially cannibalistic, but this is their belief in how they become very spiritual and how they're able to pass on. And so with them, this is something that they just do, and we have found in this particular tribe that kuru is extremely predominant. So here's a look at this very interesting little protein. It's very small. Like I said, on the surface we all have prion proteins, but what happens is when that Fc, that scrappy protein, starts to accumulate and is then actually taken inside of the cell via endocytosis, and now once we're inside of the cell we cause major damage, and what ends up resulting in that cell's ultimate death. And so we see this all over nervous tissue, and we start having these very, very large plaque formations. People aren't the only thing that can actually get viruses. Animals get viruses, and even plants get viruses. And from an agricultural standpoint, it's very important to know what type of viruses can infect plants. You can have a virus that infects a crop and essentially wipe out an entire field of plants. And if you're a farmer, that's your livelihood. That's how you make a living. And so we have to be very careful when there is diseased soil, or if one particular type of plant starts showing viruses, that we get that out so that other plants don't actually become infected as well. So there are plant viruses that can enter into plants also. Okay, for the next few slides, I'm just going to talk about a couple of viruses. I'm going to mention their families. I'm going to talk about if they're DNA or RNA, if they're single-stranded or if they're double-stranded, if they're enveloped or if they're non-enveloped. You guys will be responsible, just like with the bacteria. You're going to have to know these. You're going to have to be able to place them in categories, know if they're double-stranded, single-stranded, DNA, RNA types of things, and also for the ones that I talk about, the signs and symptoms that some of these would be giving us. So first up is the Parvovirdidae. This is a single-stranded DNA. It does not have an envelope. And the one mostly that we know about for this one is the parvovirus. The human parvovirus is extremely common in kids. Almost every single kid gets it at some point, typically before the age of 5. It's called Fitz disease. And Fitz disease, typical characteristics, the kid will not be really feeling well, maybe run a fever, but they'll have on their cheeks what's called a slapped cheek appearance. Like if you took your 2 hands and smacked that kid right on the face with both sides, that kind of red ring around their cheeks that goes up is what it looks like. Or maybe it looks like they got in their mom's blush and didn't know how to put their makeup on and just put tons of red pinkish blush on. That slapped cheek appearance is very characteristic of Fitz disease. Later on, they do break out in a rash. The rash typically looks worse in sunlight, so if you get them out in the sun, it will kind of amplify the rash. We usually tell parents not to worry about this. In about 7 days, it runs its course, but it can be an issue in pregnant women, and it can be an issue in immunocompromised people, because in pregnant women, parvo can potentially cross the placenta, and in immunocompromised patients, if they come into contact with Fitz disease, it can cause a really nasty anemia that is difficult for them to actually get over. Then we have the Adenovirdidae. The Adenovirdidae is typically a respiratory type of infection. The adenovirus was named because of your adenoids. This is a double-stranded DNA, also not enveloped, and this is where you get your common cold. This is going to be one of those kind of, I would say like your bronchial and up. It's not really a chest cold, but it's also not all in your head either. It's kind of that lots of drainage. You maybe have a sore throat, could have a little bit of a cough. You're going to have some sinus involvement, kind of an all over just what you think about when you have a cold. Also, a double-stranded non-enveloped virus is the Papovirdidae, which is the papillomavirus. HPV is one that we talk about in our STD lecture because HPV is rampant right now. We have tons and tons of positive tests for HPV. There are lots of different strains of HPV though. 11, 16, and 18 are the 3 that typically we vaccinate against because those are the ones that typically cause cervical penile, and rectal cancer. But you can also have HPV just on your skin if you have a wart, right? There are genital warts and then there are skin warts. Those are a different strain. Genital warts on a patient sort of look like cauliflower. I don't know, an outbreak of genital warts. If you want to see something really horrible, just go Google outbreak of genital warts, because I don't know anyone that would look at that and be like, I want some of that. It is just not something that is attractive and not something that you would want. Sort of does look like cauliflower clumps on the genitalia. Sometimes these patients have such a bad infection with the papillomavirus that the genitalias look disfigured. But you can also get warts like on your finger or on your elbow or wherever it may be. It is not caused by if a frog pees on you. I think that's one of those things that your parents tell you, don't pick up a frog because it'll cause warts. Frogs don't cause warts. That's what papillomavirus does. Another double-stranded DNA virus, but this time it is an enveloped virus that we can talk about, is the Poxvirinae. So this is going to be like our smallpox that we thankfully don't see any longer. We do know cowpox was the one that Edward Jenner vaccinated people with in order to eradicate that smallpox epidemic. We do still see molluscum contagiosum. Molluscum contagiosum is seen in a lot of kids. It sort of looks like warts, but it's not warts. They usually only attack one certain area, and a lot of times it's either near the face, like on the neck, or on the jawline, or on the armpit, or on the hand. Those are the places that we really see this. And it is a Poxvirinae. It's a pox virus that it does sort of look wart-like or kind of like a skin tag. Best thing that you can do is really leave it alone, because for the most part, if you try to squeeze them or pop them, that's when they spread. And typically in kids, these will last anywhere from 6 months to about a year and a half, and then they go away, and a lot of times we never see them come back. Another double-stranded DNA virus, and also an envelope virus, is the herpes viridae. We've talked about this several times. Type 1 is above the belt. Type 2 is genital herpes below the belt. Type 3, there's your varicella, that is chickenpox, and also can then open up back into shingles. Also on here, you may have heard of roseola. That's a very common infection, viral infection that a lot of babies get. That's actually a herpes virus 6. They'll run a really high fever, get this characteristic rash to them. We also see herpes 8. Herpes 8 is Kaposi sarcoma. That's typically seen in immunocompromised patients, especially HIV patients get this. If you've ever seen those purple lesions that are associated on the skin of HIV and AIDS patients, that's Kaposi sarcoma. Thing that a lot of people don't realize, though, is just how they can be on your skin. That can also be internally. So they can line the esophagus and the intestines and cause some really major discomfort there. When I was working at the free clinic, we had a patient that came in having difficulty breathing, and he actually had an active Kaposi sarcoma outbreak inside of the trachea, and was really, really suffering from this, having a lot of issues just kind of drawing in a breath and getting enough air, because his airway was swelling due to the herpes infection. This is Habadina-Viridae, also double-stranded DNA virus that is enveloped. This is hepatitis B. This particular virus is the other virus that I want you to know that utilizes reverse transcriptase. So this particular virus, along with HIV, utilize reverse transcriptase in order to actually take their own RNA and use that as a template to produce host cell DNA. Next up is a single-stranded virus, and this time it's an RNA virus. It's a positive strand that is non-enveloped. And this is a really tiny little virus called the Picornaviridae, and probably two of the most known for these are the enterovirus. There's an enterovirus that does include your polio or your Coxsackie types of viruses. Polio, as you know, is one that we have seen, thankfully, a vaccine for. So a lot of times we don't have positive polio any longer. We also see in this particular family of enteroviruses some nasty type of upper respiratory infections. Coxsackie is actually one that we worry about in babies, simply because if a baby, a newborn, gets a Coxsackie virus, a lot of times it can attack the heart valves and they can have cardiovascular issues. We also have on this list the rhinovirus. Rhinovirus is also a cold, but now you're more in the head cold. This is kind of that sinus congestion where your head is pounding, your nose is running, and it all seems to be up in your head. And hepatitis A is here also. There's lots of different types of hepatitis. B is the one that you're vaccinated, that you're vaccinated against. And then A is typically foodborne. We see sometimes there will be outbreaks of hepatitis A in restaurants where they'll have to shut down and make sure that everything gets cleaned and sterilized before they can open back up. Another single-stranded RNA virus that's also positive strand is non-enveloped, is the virus that, everybody has it, I don't want it, I can't stand it. It's the norovirus. That's your stomach bug. Right there is what typically you get, and you are puking your guts up for at least 24 hours, sometimes longer. We do see outbreaks of this sometimes can happen on cruise ships in particular. If you remember back in a few years ago, they had I can't remember if it was the Royal Caribbean or it was one of the larger cruise ship lines that actually had to turn around and they had to refund everyone's money because essentially what happened is they had an outbreak of norovirus, and so everyone was sick as a dog on the cruise and couldn't participate in anything because they were so ill, and so they had to turn around and come back, bleach everything down. The interesting thing about norovirus is it can live on a surface for 6 months. You think about that. If someone is sick and they so happen to puke somewhere and it doesn't get cleaned properly, it can live there for 6 months, and then you just so happen to come into contact with it and somehow you put your hands on it and then put your hands in your mouth, and now you can actually get sick. A single-stranded RNA that is positive strand but is enveloped is Artogavirdiae. These are a lot of the alpha viruses, are those that are spread particularly by mosquitoes. That's the eastern equine encephalopathy and the western equine encephalopathy. And those are transmitted, as I said, by the bite of a mosquito. We also have rubella on here, the MMR, measles, mumps, and rubella. This is the virus that you are protected against with that vaccine. Another single-stranded RNA positive envelope is your Flavivirdiae. This is going to include West Nile. It's also going to include hepatitis C. We're finding more and more patients actually positive with hepatitis C, and we just come on the market. I mean, if you've been keeping up, if you read about developments in medicine at all, there is a potential cure for hepatitis C that is very close on the market now, and people are really watching this new drug, kind of seeing what it's doing for patients with hepatitis. Next single-stranded RNA virus, still positive strand, still enveloped, is the Coronavirdiae. The coronavirus is an upper respiratory infection. This is a little more serious than just your cold. This is more of your chest congestion. A lot of times your lungs will be kind of, really heavy feeling, and you feel like you've got a lot of mucus and a lot of drainage, and usually you have quite a bit of bronchial infections as well, where the upper airways are just not feeling well. So upper respiratory infections, there was a tweak on this particular virus back in 2003, which gave us SARS. And remember with SARS, that broke out in a lot of Asian countries, and there were a lot of people that were dying from what used to be just a normal cold, kind of upper respiratory infection, and now all of a sudden you were going into respiratory distress, and people were dying from this. Next up is still single-stranded RNA, but now this is a negative strand, and since it's single-stranded, there's only one single strand of RNA. There's a lot of animal diseases that are found here, but the one, the rhabdo that I want to talk about, the rhabdoviridea that I want to talk about, is the Lissa virus. The Lissa virus is actually rabies. Patients know rabies, can come into contact with an animal that has rabies by their bite, because this particular virus is actually found in the saliva when they bite you. But it's interesting because when I ask people about what typical signs and symptoms of rabies are, they always give you the signs and symptoms that come from Old Yeller. You remember that movie where Old Yeller gets attacked and he gets rabies? He's like snarling and foaming at the mouth. And yes, that potentially can be rabies, but actually that's not what we see. The most common presentation of an animal with rabies is. Animals that carry rabies like skunks, possums, raccoons, typically they are born to fear humans. That's one of the ways they survive. Wild animals have a natural instinct to run away from you. An animal that has rabies a lot of times will actually not only run, not only stay away from you, they'll actually come towards you. They'll seem very friendly, almost like they want you to pet them. They'll come right up to you. And I know a lot of people are like, oh, that is so sweet. No, that's not so sweet. That's rabid. Get away from me. If an animal that you come into contact with in the woods, out in nature, is coming to you and doesn't seem fearful of you at all, you need to be extremely leery of that animal. There are animals that carry rabies in Kentucky all over the place. We have one of the highest content of bats that have rabies. There are a lot of bats that actually carry rabies in western Kentucky. So be leery of that, as I said, because I know a lot of people who think that if an animal is rabid, it's going to be snarling and foaming at the mouth. And yes, that is one form, the aggressive form that they can take. But more often we do see those animals kind of gently and sort of just seem very calm and come right up to you like they're not afraid at all, and then they bite you. Another single-stranded RNA virus that's a negative strand is the filoviridae. In the filovirus, this is where we have Ebola. These are your hemorrhagic types of fevers where if you were to, this particular one is enveloped, and if you were potentially to come into contact with someone with Ebola and see their signs and symptoms, they bleed from every orifice possible. They bleed out their eyes, out their nose, out their ears. Even some of their pores, where their sweat glands come out, will be bleeding. So it looks like kind of they're sweating blood. Under their fingernails, toenails, rectally, vaginally, anywhere that potentially could leak blood is what we see with Ebola patients. Another strand that we have that is single-stranded RNA, that's a negative strand, the paramyxovirus. With paramyxovirus, this is where we see the mumps. So again, MMR, measles, mumps, and rubella. Typically with mumps, patients do have a swelling, particularly in the face of the parotid gland. The parotid gland sits right in your cheek, essentially, is where your parotid glands are. And the swelling, though, will kind of swell up the whole side of the face and even down into the neck some. With boys, they'll have what's called orchitis, which is a swelling of the testicles. We also see that very indicative of a mumps infection. We then have I'm going to skip that one. We then have a single-stranded RNA virus that is negative strand. However, these actually don't just have one RNA strand. They have multiple strands that we can find. And orthomyxoviridae is one that's easy to talk about because, you know, there's different strands of influenza. I mean, when you think about influenza, you can think about the bird flu and the swine flu. There's influenza A, which you're vaccinated against. There's influenza B, influenza C, multiple different strains of this that go around, and sometimes they go around on a yearly basis. If you think about not this year but last year, the vaccine that the CDC sent out was essentially not at all effective against the strain of influenza that ended up coming out for that year. Typically, influenza A is the worst, influenza B a little worse than a cold, but not quite as bad as A. And then with influenza C, we find that that's very difficult to tell the difference between just the common cold and actual influenza. We find with patients who have the flu, usually there's no GI involvement, so they'll have weakness, body aches, high fever. They'll be very tired. They'll hurt all over. They feel like they've kind of been ran over by a Mack truck, but they usually don't have any vomiting. That was the big thing about swine flu. Whenever patients started coming in with swine flu, they actually started telling the symptom of severe amounts of vomiting. And when they tested that particular strain of H1N1, they found that it did actually have GI involvement. We know that this is one in particular that has crossed the species barrier, which has led a lot of virologists are people who study viruses, it's led them to kind of essentially wonder, okay, what else could potentially cross over? If we can have bird flu and we can have swine flu, what else genetically could exchange its material enough that it could now transmit into a human virus? And that's something very interesting to think about when you think about all the things potentially that we could maybe get. Another multiple strand of RNA that we see, still single-stranded RNA, still negative-stranded. This is the Bunyaviridae, the hantavirus. This is actually a hemorrhagic fever, nothing to the extent of what we see with Ebola, but it is a hemorrhagic fever, and we do actually see it in the United States. We see it in California. This is carried by field mice. And the mice will come into people's homes, especially if if they live maybe on a farm somewhere like that where it's not right down in the city. But these field mice will come in and potentially be carrying this particular virus where humans can come into contact with it. And it is a hemorrhagic type of fever. Again, nothing to the extreme of what Ebola is, but still in the classification of a hemorrhagic fever. We also see, I'm going to skip that one, the single-stranded RNA that has two strands of RNA that will turn around and produce DNA. So this is one of that uses reverse transcriptase is Retroviridae, and you guys know this is the lentivirus, which is HIV. HIV is astounding when you look at the statistics of what we know about HIV and how many patients are actually being diagnosed on a daily basis as a new HIV patient. Something like 14,000 new patients a day. There's over 44 million patients that have HIV at the moment. One of the double-stranded RNA viruses that is not enveloped, this is going to be kind of the last one that I talk about. Again, I know that there's no way that I could talk about every single one of the viruses, and kind of sitting here thinking I know one that I left out, which is RSV, right? The respiratory syncytial virus that we see in newborns. That's RSV season is usually between November through March-ish. And we worry about especially newborns getting that RSV because their lungs and muscles to cough up things are so weakened, and they do a lot of times end up in the hospital. But this double-stranded RNA virus that we have that is non-enveloped is a Riovirdae. The rotavirus is on here. Typically, the rotavirus causes respiratory infections along with the GI infections, and a lot of these little things are just so pitiful because they're vomiting, they're having diarrhea, they're coughing, all at the same time. Many babies do end up in the ER simply because of dehydration. It's not necessarily that we see tons and tons of children that die from this, because a lot of times we can get them in and get them rehydrated. But a few years ago, we did come up with a vaccine for this. It's an oral vaccine that children take and are able to then circulate these antibodies, and that has reduced greatly the amount of rotavirus infections that we see. So these particular patients that get the rotavirus, a lot of times it's one of those, let's get them in, let's get them rehydrated, and then get them back home type of thing. But anytime you can save a young baby, young newborn in particular, from having to go into the hospital, that's something that we want to try to do. So the rotavirus is an oral vaccine that you give at 2 weeks. It's one of the first vaccines that babies actually do get. So again, with these viruses, there's so many different ones that we could potentially talk about and potentially go over, but I just wanted to give you a really kind of generalized look at viruses, what they do, how they're spread, kind of the classifications that we see. And trust me, if you guys are going into healthcare, you are going to see plenty of viruses. And unfortunately, a lot of times what you just have to tell people is, you know what? It's a virus and it's just going to have to run its course. And that's one thing that nobody wants to hear, but a lot of times that's very true when it comes to viral infections. All right, guys, that's it for the chapter on viruses, which means that's the end of the lecture material for exam 3. I'll get that review up for you guys as soon as I can. Thanks so much. See you in a bit.